Hi everyone, this is Mike, Phil, Jocelyn, and Liz, and we are here to introduce our concept web for the second group project. And as you can see, it's very big, and Mike is going to start off by focusing on perception and cross-culture communication and how they relate to each other.
Alright, perception and cross-culture communication go hand in hand when talking about interpersonal skills. First, there are three main elements of perception. You have the inner world, outer world, and a belief system. Things that control your inner world perception include your senses, expectations, emotions, desires, self-perception, and lastly, your attitude. Attitude also relates directly to your belief systems. Depending on if you have a good or bad attitude on a situation, that's going to determine your belief systems. Your habits and comfort zone also play a big role in determining what your belief systems will be made up of. The last element of perception is the outer physical world, which consists of verbal or nonverbal actions, gender, observations, and culture. I'll explain culture soon here when I get into cross-culture communication. Finally, there are many errors in perception. These errors include stereotyping, the halo effect, or also known as making assumptions, and attribution. Errors in perception also relate to demographic realities, which is a main component of cross-culture communication. If you create stereotypes about a certain culture, then you really don't know their demographic realities of that culture. Another large component of cross-culture communication is asking yourself, what is culture? Like I said, culture is seen in the outer physical world of perception and is defined as a medium evolved by humans to survive in their environment. A few classifications of cultural patterns include self-orientation and high context versus low context culture. Japan and China are a few examples of a high context culture, while the United States is an example of a low context culture. The last main component of cross-culture communication is how culture and communication relates to cross-cultural competence. Cross-cultural competence involves knowing yourself and your culture, avoiding stereotyping and prejudice, and developing and displaying a sense of empathy. Now Phil will talk about how you can develop a sense of empathy.
The interpersonal skills, resolving conflict and responding with empathy, are easily relatable. This is evident when you start by looking at the successful strategies for coping with conflict, such as collaboration, compromise, and accommodation. Collaboration is finding a solution that satisfies the concerns of both parties, and compromise is very similar as you try to find a mutually acceptable solution. Accommodation involves dropping your own personal concerns and focusing on another person's problems. All of these strategies can then be looked at as successful strategies for responding with empathy. For example, with collaboration, you're trying to find a solution that satisfies everyone's concerns, which is very similar to harmonizing, one of the successful ways to respond with empathy. On top of that, in accommodation, you are neglecting your own personal concerns and focusing on helping another person get through his problem. Just like harmonizing, offering help is another successful way to respond with empathy, along with giving advice and confidentiality. Overall, the same strategies used to resolve conflict can also be used to respond with empathy. Another important skill to use when trying to resolve conflict is active listening. Elizabeth will now tell you more about that and nonverbal communication.
I'm going to discuss how active listening relates and connects to nonverbal communication. And really, the most important thing to know about these two skills is that you can use nonverbal cues to send messages to people that you are actively listening to while they interpret the meaning of your nonverbal communication. First, let's start with active listening. This skill is all about interpreting sounds and making meaning of them. There are two main things to know about active listening. First, there are 6 stages to the listening process. They are hearing, focusing on the message, comprehending and interpreting the message, responding, and remembering the message. Before you can do all these things, you must overcome barriers of distraction that will get in the way when you are trying to understand the message. There are 3 main barriers, and they are environmental, physiological, and psychological. And within the psychological barrier is where we can connect nonverbal communication. Negative listening attitude, personal reaction, selective listening, and poor motivation fall under the psychological barrier. Now, let's jump back up to the nonverbal communication and talk what that is all about. This type of communication is all about language without words. There are 5 channels, which are appearance, facial expression, eye contact, body language, and proxemics. I believe all 5 of these connect to active listening because if you have positive appearance and look like you care, are making solid eye contact and raising your eyebrow once in a while as if you're interested, have positive body language, and are not slouched or giving off a bad vibe, then you will be helping your personal reaction within your active listening skill. It's most important to make sure you have a good personal reaction even if you disagree or dislike what the other person is saying. Do not give off bad verbal cues because that reflects on your character and how much you care about what the other person is saying. All of these things will factor into how long your conversation might last and even your relationship with the person you are listening and communicating with. Going off of relationships, Jocelyn is going to talk about the nature of influence and power within relationships and gender issues also within relationships.
My 2 issues were the nature of influence and power and gender issues. With the nature of influence and power, the biggest points in the chapter were the sources of power and the influence outcomes. Influence outcomes show whether or not attempted influence was successful. Personal responses to inappropriate use of power include passive, aggressive, and assertive behavior, of which assertive behavior is the ideal response. For gender issues, some of the largest problems in today's society having to do with gender include the glass ceiling concept, stereotypes, and sexual harassment. Some of these problems have to do with the use of gender-exclusive language in communication, which is addressed in the chapter. Some examples of gender-exclusive vocabulary include mailman, congressman, and actress. I connected the sexual harassment component of gender issues with the assertive behavior component of the nature of power and influence. Any inappropriate use of power or influence based on gender should always be addressed by the subjected individual using assertive behavior tactics. These include firm but pleasant speech, owning one's feelings, and eye contact.
And that is our concept web. We hope you enjoyed learning about these interpersonal skills and how they relate to each other. Thank you.